Nothing about this war was accidental. The clones weren't an emergency hire, the droids weren't the best army the Separatists could afford, and the war itself wasn't a misunderstanding that grew into a galactic conflict. The soldiers were grown in secret for a war that hadn't started yet. The droids were rolled off assembly lines by corporations that wanted cheap and got broken. The same man ordered the army, built the Separatists, and ran the Republic that fought them. 3 years of fighting, trillions dead, the Jedi Order destroyed, and an empire built on the ruins. Everything happened the way one man had planned it from the start. Every day of those 3 years started the same way. A single soldier, waking up inside a life he had never been asked about. Every single day, a clone trooper lived inside a life that had been decided before he was born. Not a life chosen from available options, but one engineered from a genetic template, accelerated through a compressed childhood, and delivered to a battlefield with a single purpose already installed. The galaxy saw identical soldiers in white armor, indistinguishable from one another, following orders without hesitation or complaint. Behind that image, the truth looked nothing like that. What these men actually did each day, from the first maintenance check before sunrise to the quiet rituals they performed after dark, reveals something the Republic never fully acknowledged. Before the briefings or the battles, or the nights spent sleeping with weapons still in hand, the most precisely engineered army in galactic history first had to serve the simple act of being human when nothing about its design encouraged it. Upon examining both Legends and canon sources, a day in the life of a clone trooper is far different from what most people would expect. A clone trooper's story did not begin at sunrise. It began in a world of glass and fluid, far from any battlefield, on a storm-battered ocean world at the edge of the galaxy. The earliest stage of a clone's life took place inside fluid-filled glass spheres deep within the towers of Tipoca City on Kamino, as shown in Star Wars Attack of the Clones. To produce soldiers on a timeline the galactic government could actually use, Kamino and engineers applied accelerated growth treatments that cut the journey from birth to physical adulthood in half. A normal human needs 20 years to reach maturity. These men reach it in 10, and nothing about that compression was accidental. As the young soldiers grew, their days followed a structure that left almost nothing resembling a normal childhood. Large classrooms filled with children sitting in neat rows, all wearing identical clothes, sharing identical haircuts, focused on the same lessons at the same time. They were noticeably more disciplined than regular children, not because they had been punished into compliance, but because they had been grown that way. Independent thinking, personal curiosity, and individual personality had been reduced from the basic design from the very start. When the school day ended, they did not scatter or play freely. They climbed into narrow, transparent tubes, sealed themselves inside, and rested in the same orderly fashion they had done everything else, lined up in rows, just as they had been during lessons. Their genetic foundation, as explored in Star Wars Labyrinth of Evil, was a bounty hunter named Jango Fett, a man with Mandalorian roots whose physical and tactical qualities the Kaminoan engineers selected as the ideal foundation for a large military force. Standard troopers had most of his independent personality removed from their design because the engineers wanted men who followed orders without hesitation, not warriors who made their own calls when situations became complicated. Advanced Recon Commandos, referred to as ARCs, were a partial exception, retaining stronger personal initiative and better leadership ability. For the overwhelming majority of the army, however, that independent streak was treated as something to engineer away before the soldiers ever left their ranks. The most revealing detail in that early history came from the book Republic Commando: Hard Contact. Despite their adult physical builds and elite combat skills, clone commandos were only 10 years old in real time. They also knew that their accelerated aging meant shorter lives than any regular human would have, and that awareness gave many of them a settled, accepting relationship with the possibility of dying. Many preferred to fall in combat rather than slowly age past the point of usefulness, not out of despair, but simply as the framework inside which they understood their own time. Most of their compressed childhood in those towers was spent in a structure the novel calls the Killing House, a live fire building with corridors that shifted and reconfigured during exercises. Conditions inside were designed to be genuinely dangerous, and some did not survive the process. Those who came out the other side carried reflexes and habits that could not have been taught any other way. They began working with rounds that hurt, but did not kill as young as age 4 or 5, before graduating to real weapons as they grew older. By the time they ever set foot on a real battlefield, the process of taking a life had already been practiced hundreds of times, and the part of the mind that hesitates before doing so had been reduced to something that barely registered. Alongside all of that, from the earliest days of schooling, every trooper was required to memorize 150 contingency orders covering worst-case scenarios. Most described situations the galactic government hoped would never arise. One of them, known only by its number, required the removal of force-sensitive commanding officers who acted against the Republic's interests. Soldiers memorized it alongside the other 149, stored it without question, and went back to their training. It sat there, unchanged, for the entire length of the war. Every soldier who ever picked up a blaster had spent his earliest years being shaped into something the war machine could use. And once the machine had built them, it had to be maintained. For these men, every day began not with purpose, but with a checklist. The book Hard Contact describes the morning routine with exact detail. A soldier started by cleaning boot clamps with pressure tools, rinsing suit liners, and running sensors across the bodysuit to confirm no break existed in the seal that would fail in a vacuum or a toxic environment. Then came the adjustment of the display system inside the helmet, followed by a full breakdown and reassembly of the DC-17 blaster rifle. After that, the survival pack was repacked following strict squad-level rules. Dry rations placed on the 5th layer, positioned between a spare rope line and a hygiene kit. From the first cleaning to the last buckle fastened, the full process took exactly 26 minutes and 20 seconds. That figure was not a guideline, it was a standard every soldier was expected to meet without exception, because a failed seal or a weapon that would not fire was the difference between completing the mission and not coming back from it. The armor itself told its own story. As noted in Star Wars Labyrinth of Evil, the hard outer shell was typically marked with mud, dry blood, and charred patches from previous engagements. The short-stock DC-15 blaster rifle showed the same wear, both soldier and weapon carrying the visible record of where they had been. Color patterns on armor plates separated individual units, with magenta and blue vertical stripes on some, yellow line helmets on the others, and gray markings on still more. Since every troopers shared the same face and the same flat, processed voice, these patterns were not decoration, they were necessary for basic recognition. As noted in the canon novel Star Wars Brotherhood, the men also distinguished themselves through scars, body markings, and personal hairstyles. One soldier named Sister wore rows of tightly braided hair falling over her armored shoulders, a detail that says something real about how the men inside those suits held on to who they were. Yet the helmet was more than armor. For men who owned almost nothing, it was the one private space the war allowed them. The book Republic Commando 000 expands on what the helmet meant to the men who wore it. In the warrior language they inherited from their Mandalorian trainers, it was called a boucher, and once sealed, it became a private space. Through the internal communicator, a trooper could listen to music, folk songs, the Mon Call opera, or the marching anthem Vote-On, meaning brothers all. During a war that offered almost nothing personal, that small boundary carried real weight. A few minutes of chosen sound before the outside world came back in. Even hygiene was managed with tactical thinking. The series Republic Commando Order 66 notes that troopers shaved using a sharp blade with no foam or scented product, because any smell could reveal a position to enemies using scent-based tracking. Personal care was never purely personal, it was always also part of staying hidden and alive. That same source explains that the Katarn armor system included an internal water supply processed through the suit's own filters, coming out warm. Troopers drank it without complaint, because they had been trained not to spend time objecting to things that could not be changed. And then there was the matter of food, which revealed as much about these men's lives as any briefing document ever could. The standard field ration documented in Hard Contact was a white, tasteless, odorless compressed square of nutrition. No scent reduced the risk of alerting enemies during a quiet approach. No plant fiber meant fewer physical traces that could be followed across open terrain. Nothing about it resembled a meal in any real sense. It simply kept a soldier functioning. Yet, what these men actually wanted when given a choice told the real story. The novel 000 gives the clearest picture of that. Sticky Ooge cake was a consistent favorite. Wara nuts, Vuelu nuts, and fresh Kavara fruit were prized when available, with some describing real food as a genuinely wonderful experience compared to their standard compressed squares. Off-duty near a settlement, they sought out spots like the Kraget for greasy meals of smoked meat or eggs, or Kibu's hut for thick Nerf steaks washed down with large amounts of calf. Base mess halls sometimes provided minced Nerf stew, shaka noodles, fruit pie, and sausages, none of which were remarkable by outside standards, but measured against a tasteless nutrition block, they were genuinely worth appreciating. By the time the last buckle was fastened and the nutrition block was finished, the seal visor was already carrying something the morning routine had never accounted for. Somewhere behind it, a man who had been engineered to feel satisfaction in battle was already listening to music through a communicator no one else could hear. With armor sealed and the morning behind them, the day's focus shifted towards the work itself. The process that preceded every operation revealed how these men thought, communicated, and relied on one another in ways the design had never fully anticipated. As detailed in 000, operational instructions were delivered using three-dimensional display maps of the target area. Soldiers studied entry and exit points, confirmed individual assignments, and reviewed backup plans before moving out. Nothing about the process was slow or informal, because a military built for efficiency from the ground up had no room for either. A four-person squad was taught to think of itself as a hand, with each member being one finger, limited alone but forming something formidable together. Not every day on the front involved direct combat. Every day required complete readiness for it regardless, and that readiness extended far beyond the weapon in a soldier's hands. The canon novel Brotherhood shows that troopers spent significant time handling the routine outside of military operations, logging supply lists, checking delivery points, and planning distribution routes based on specific hazards in each environment. Some missions were support operations entirely, delivering medical supplies, food rations, and building materials to regions damaged by the fighting. Mission preparation included loading extra materials, typically 3 to 5% above the calculated amount, to cover any loss or damage in transit. Field commanders provided detailed status reports to their commanding officers and to the Chancellor's office, including casualty counts, terrain models, and records of sector activity. A clone trooper was expected to function as a soldier, a supply manager, a technical specialist, and a reporting officer, often within the same working day. Labyrinth of Evil notes that medical specialists handled the wounded in the field, communication specialists maintained the systems that kept units connected, and pilots flew escort and attack runs. Field commanders like Commander Cody wore orange color-coded armor markings and arm stripes recording which campaigns they had served in. Some troopers worked in bomb disposal units or in repair facilities converted to produce weapons and defensive equipment for the front. In cities including the galactic capital, soldiers were assigned to extended observation work, sitting in concealed vehicles for hours under one of 4 rotating watch assignments: red, blue, green, or white, monitoring specific locations through infrared equipment. That same source establishes that soldiers communicated on 2 channels at the same time. Voice contact ran through communicators built into the helmet, while a detailed system of hand signals allowed squads to coordinate without any transmission that enemy forces could intercept. Silence was a resource in combat, and the men of the clone army knew how to use it. But what happened between operations, in whatever quiet the war allowed, revealed something the mission reports never captured. The book Hard Contact describes one of the more unusual aspects of the clone experience. Ordinary people spent their lives searching for a sense of purpose, uncertain of who they were meant to be. These soldiers had been given that answer before they were old enough to question it. Their purpose was to serve the galactic government and fight under the officers assigned above them. That clarity was designed to make them effective, and it did. Yet clarity of purpose did not prevent them from forming something deeper. Brotherhood describes the men as genuinely human in how they interacted with the Force-sensitive commanders they served beside, capable of real laughter and lasting friendship. They used specific field language, calling battle droids clankers and scrap, and addressing their commanding officers formally as general. Despite sharing the same face and the same flat, processed voice, they learned to tell each other apart through small physical differences and barely noticeable details in how each man moved and carried himself. Many of them carried a private fear no amount of combat training could prepare them for. In their inherited warrior language, the word Darmanda described a state of existence without identity, heritage, or inner life. To protect against that, many troopers treated Mandalorian warrior culture as genuinely their own, learning the language, calling their trainers Buer, meaning father, and following a personal code that placed loyalty to the group above loyalty to larger institutions. This was not a rejection of the government they served, it was a way of having something real to hold on to when the structures above them felt distant and impersonal. A weapon prepared for battle still needed to prove the preparation held. When the order to engage finally came, everything these soldiers had been built to do became visible all at once, and what they demonstrated on the battlefield went far beyond what any training record could fully document. At the battle on the desert world of Geonosis, as shown in Attack of the Clones, the men immediately seized the highest available ground and the most defensible terrain on the field, operating speeder bikes and gunships while adjusting to changing conditions in ways that pre-programmed droid forces could not replicate. Droids could execute instructions, clone troopers could respond to situations those instructions had never anticipated, and that ability to adapt was precisely why they were valued above mechanical soldiers. The novelization Star Wars Revenge of the Sith extends the picture into space and across active ground deployments. Clone pilots flew their fighters with precise coordination, running screening operations for large warships, with units like Squad 7 and Squad 4 operating ARC-170s and V-Wing fighters in organized formations. On the ground, field commanders coordinated heavy weapons teams using shoulder-launched torpedoes and explosive grenades, while troops arrived in active combat zones via gunships and armored transports, descending on rope lines while firing as they came down. The book Hard Contact captures what battle looked and felt like from inside the helmet. The display system in the visor constantly updated with weapon charge levels, armor condition readings, and distance measurements, all processed through small eye movements, with soldiers focusing on what was immediately relevant and setting them aside. Sound was a constant presence, even through the helmet's protection. The rhythm of incoming fire felt through the boots as much as heard through the ears, vibrations moving up from the ground with each nearby impact. What the body registered in combat could not be filtered out the way data on a display could. The novel Star Wars Shatterpoint describes what happens when a unit refuses to stop moving. Clone units moved in wedge formations, pressing forward through incoming fire without stopping, even as soldiers fell on the other side. On foot, units also used curved attack patterns to surround droid forces, closing from multiple angles at once. Their method was swift, organized, and clean. They did not fight for personal recognition. They fought for the regiment and for the brothers beside them, because that was how they had been trained to think, and the battlefield confirmed it consistently. Yet, the most revealing moments were not the ones captured in military reports. That same storyline captures what commitment looked like when there was nothing left to fight with. When a transport was destroyed in space, and soldiers were left floating in a vacuum, some used the lift systems on their backs to drive themselves directly into the path of incoming enemy fighters, using their own bodies to shield the men they'd served with. Even in that moment, they maintained organized fire control, coordinating their rifles against enemy shields until the end. It was simply the task in front of them, and they completed it. Not every trooper who entered a combat zone came back functional, and what happened to those who were hit followed its own organized and often brutal system. The book MedStar 1 Battle Surgeons documents the most common injuries treated at the mobile surgical units the galactic government call RIMSUs. Surgeons regularly worked on chest wounds that pulled air through the body, injuries packed with metal fragments, severe burns from flame weapons, and serious head trauma. In the jungle world of Drongar, the air carried tiny spores capable of triggering spore sickness, causing patients to cough up blood while their body temperature climbed out of control. Electric storms on the surface were violent enough to reduce a trooper to a pair of smoking boots in seconds. The harder outer shell offered less protection than its appearance suggested. Metal fragments cut through it, and flame weapons overwhelmed it entirely. The same source describes weapons built specifically to bypass standard defenses, including a guided tomb called a weed cutter that flew over defensive walls and detonated at chest height, releasing sharp metal fragments in every direction. An experimental device called the Agonizer used targeted sound waves to cause severe pain without leaving any physical wound, sometimes killing the target when the nervous system could not absorb any more input. Treatment at the field hospital followed a numbered rating system. Small colored tags ranked injuries from 1 through 6, with a separate X marking for those considered beyond saving given the number of patients waiting. The surgical approach on the Drongar front was quick and rough, focused on stopping blood loss, covering the wound, and moving to the next patient as long as the trooper could still function when finished. One feature the armor reliably provided, regardless of its other limits, was automatic pain relief. When a trooper was hit, the suit pushed pain-reducing medicine into the body, keeping the soldier alert long enough to be moved to treatment. Labyrinth of Evil notes that because every trooper shared the same genetic makeup, blood transfers and organ replacements between them required no medication to prevent the body from rejecting new tissue. Medical teams working with clone patients treated the shared biology as a practical resource, listing replacement organs in supply logs the same way ammunition and equipment were cataloged. The troopers themselves referred to blood and spare organs simply as spare parts, a term that reflected how completely the system had treated their identical biology as something ordinary and replaceable. Yet the book MedStar 1 documents a detail that complicates every assumption behind that clinical language. A trooper identified as CT-914 expressed genuine and lasting grief over the death of a brother from his training group, a grief that would remain with him until his own death. The conditioning had not removed the ability to carry loss. Some medical personnel early in the war had called these soldiers meat droids, seeing them as identical and therefore not fully deserving of individual consideration. Anyone who worked closely enough with them eventually understood that characterization was wrong. The doctors who began treating them as equipment did not finish that way. On Drongar, a plant called Boda had remarkable healing properties, enough that both the galactic government and the Separatists were fighting over control of the fields where it grew. Clone troopers bled and died protecting those fields every single day, yet military policy classified the plant as too valuable to be used on the men who guarded it. Some doctors quietly used it to treat infections that responded to nothing else, but officially, the soldiers who protected the crop had no access to it. They fought for something they were not permitted to benefit from, and most of them never raised the issue. The body that survived the afternoon still needed to find rest, but rest for these men was something the design had never fully made room for. Between missions, in whatever quiet the war allowed, these men lived with realities that most soldiers never had to face, and they developed practices that managed those realities that the military had never formally authorized or anticipated. The book Order 66 describes a daily practice some used to maintain their connection to those they had lost. A custom called Ahan in their inherited tradition involves speaking the names of fallen brothers out loud, sometimes at the start of the day and sometimes at the end, combining a sense of peace for those still living with a genuine sorrow for those who were gone. For men without families in any traditional sense, it was the closest thing many had to a meaningful personal practice not tied to a mission. The novel 000 documents off-duty life with real detail. Troopers gambled on small insect races, stories about new equipment passed around with equal enthusiasm, whether accurate or not. Holobooks were read when available, and the Da Werda Verda, an ancient battle chant inherited from their Mandalorian trainers, was performed by hammering on each other's armor plates in a coordinated rhythm that filled whatever space they occupied. For men without families, this shared practice connected them to each other and to something that felt older and more stable than the war they were currently fighting. A night away from the base, called a run ashore in military slang, meant visiting social clubs or lower-level cantinas near wherever they were stationed, drinking ale, telling long jokes, and competing at knife-throwing games. Some troopers described something called feeling it, a shorthand used within the ranks for the built-up battle stress and short-fuse anger that came from years of continuous fighting without any real break. No one talked about it directly as a problem. It was simply acknowledged as part of what they carried, the way they acknowledged the weight of the armor or the taste of the ration block as a fixed condition of the existence they had been given. When a squad took losses and one man came back where 4 had gone in, the training was not adequate preparation for what that felt like. Hard contact adds a detail that shapes how these evenings felt beneath the surface. The engineers made targeted adjustments to the part of the brain responsible for the instincts to freeze or run under threat, reducing natural hesitation and producing soldiers who were genuinely fearless in combat. These men were also built to feel satisfaction in battle, designed with just enough pain response to warn of injury without that pain becoming so overwhelming it stopped them from functioning. They had not simply been trained to fight, they had been built to want to, and they remained fully capable of feeling every part of what that war cost them. Survivor's guilt was real, even when it was not supposed to be part of the design. Most Most commandos were so trained towards constant awareness that many slept with their weapons still in their hands. The body rested, but the awareness did not fully close. Time on base still included physical training and close combat drills, even when rest was the official status, because staying capable was not something that could simply be paused because the assignments had stopped for a day. The novelization Revenge of the Sith confirms in broader terms what the Republic Commando series shows in specific detail. Across the full length of the Clone Wars, these men had trained together, eaten together, played together, argued with each other, and kept each other moving through years of uninterrupted service. Their helmet speakers reduced their voices to a flat, consistent tone, the same whether they were scared, frustrated, or placing a food order. But the real connections beneath that sound were genuine, and that novel treats them as such without reduction. For these soldiers, brotherhood was not a figure of speech. It was the entire structure of their personal lives, the one thing the design had never fully managed to engineer away. The book Order 66 documents that these men were classified as military assets with no legal rights and no citizenship, considered property in the eyes of the Senate. Much of their tactical knowledge had been placed deep in their minds during their time in the growth tanks, giving them highly developed skills, but leaving gaps in the kind of social knowledge that most people build naturally over years of lived experience. Non-clone personnel who encountered them sometimes referred to these men as vatborn, a term that carried its own quiet dismissal, and many troopers knew exactly what it implied. They were effective, and they were aware that the system which relied on their effectiveness did not extend that recognition to any other part of how it regarded them. Star Wars Shatterpoint puts the numbers into direct perspective. Starting with 1.2 million soldiers, the Grand Army kept its men in constant motion, moving from system to system to meet droid attacks across the full width of the galaxy. Even that number was insufficient, with the source noting that the total barely provided one trooper per planet in the government's territory. Labyrinth of Evil adds a harder figure. By the time the fighting reached the Outer Rim, the original 1.2 million had been reduced to roughly half still capable of active service. Around 600,000 men remain from an army that had started twice as large, a phrase that moved through the ranks. The right man for the job was repeated because the mission required it, not because the numbers made it comfortable to believe. On worlds like Harun Kal, the fighting mixed jungle survival with unplanned skirmishes and local resistance tactics, what soldiers in the field call the summertime war. Those who performed well in large organized battles found those conditions to be a completely different kind of challenge, one that standard training had not fully prepared them for. The army adapted because it had no alternative, but the costs were real. At the end of each night, the one order no trooper ever discussed sat exactly where it had always been, memorized alongside the other 149, waiting for the signal that had not yet come. The novelization of Revenge of the Sith describes the carrying out of that final standing instruction without hesitation. When the signal came, it turned every military post and transit point across the galaxy into a position of ambush at the same time. Troopers who had served alongside their force-sensitive commanders for years, who would follow them into firefights, eaten in the same mess halls, and reported to them every day of the war, turned and fired without pause. The directive did not require hatred. It required only that the order be followed, and these men had been built to do exactly that since the day they memorized it. Their mission shifted from fighting the Separatist military to clearing the Jedi Temple of all living occupants, and they approached the second task with the same organized efficiency they had brought to every other operation. Occupying that building produced something unexpected. These men had been trained from their earliest schooling to be completely unaffected by anything unexplained. But in the darkened corridors of the temple after the fighting ended, sounds moved through the structure without a clear cause. Shadows shifted in ways that could not be immediately explained. Some soldiers began to quietly suggest the building might be haunted. Everything about their preparation had been designed to prevent exactly that kind of thinking. Yet, standing in those halls, some found that particular lesson harder to hold on to than usual. When the last room was cleared, troopers moved through the building comparing the dead against unit records and the temple's own files, confirming names, marking entries, making sure every name was accounted for before the count could be closed. Bodies were cross-checked and officially recorded as traitors and collaborators, the language of the new order they were now serving. It was careful, routine paperwork attached to violent action, a combination that had defined much of what these soldiers had done across 3 years of war. Throughout all of it, the helmet speakers kept every voice voice level, flat, and exactly the same. A single day in the life of a clone trooper reveals the full truth of what it meant to be the Republic's army. That truth had nothing to do with identical faces or interchangeable parts. It was maintenance, discipline, brotherhood, grief, and endurance, all compressed into a repeating cycle designed to keep engineering men useful to a government that had never fully resolved whether they deserve more than instructions. The armor started the day, the briefing focused on the purpose, the battle proved the design functioned, the quiet rituals after dark reveal what the design had failed to remove, and 150 memorized orders waited in the background of every single one of those days, unchanged without question for the entire length of the war. Every element of the routine served a system that needed soldiers who were strong enough to fight, obedient enough to follow any order, and isolated enough by design that they would never have cause to ask why. For 3 years, the galaxy's most precisely engineered army lived this way, not as citizens, not as individuals in the eyes of the Senate, but as men who had built something genuinely human inside a framework that had never intended to give them the space to do so. That was the Republic's army. On the other side of the same war stood another manufactured force, and the contempt the clones felt for it was not just military. The B-1 battle droids talked through every firefight, narrated their own confusion mid-battle, and became the strangest army the galaxy had ever seen. None of that chatter was personality, it was failure.
B-1 battle droids were never designed to have personality. Yet, all that chatter, the confused observations, the running commentary mid-battle, made them iconic. None of it was programmed. But Canon and Legends sources reveal the real cause behind the talking, and it's far darker than comic relief. The story begins in the factories of Bactoid Combat Automata, long before the Clone Wars. The Legends reference book, The Essential Guide to Warfare, explains that the Trade Federation, a powerful commerce guild that controlled shipping lanes across the galaxy, originally commissioned B-1 units for a simple purpose: protecting cargo ships from pirates. The design specifications reflected this limited role, with Bactoid engineers building the droids using cheap cognitive modules, essentially their computer brains, along with basic sensors and thin armor. These were meant to be throwaway security guards, not real soldiers, and the Trade Federation's well-known cheapness ensured low-quality construction from the start. However, the cheap construction was not just about cutting costs. The Neimoidians who ran the Federation had specific reasons for choosing droids over living soldiers. The canon reference book Attack of the Clones: The Visual Dictionary describes them as too fearful to fight their own battles, and too paranoid to trust living soldiers with weapons that might be turned against them. Battle droids solved both problems: mindlessly loyal, completely obedient, and endlessly replaceable. If 1,000 were destroyed, the Federation simply ordered more without any of the costs that came with living troops. This throwaway mindset extended even to the physical design. Bactoid engineers built the battle droids to look like Geonosians, the insect-like species whose factories would later produce B-1s by the billions. Neimoidian crew members spread rumors that the droids' long faces were modeled after Neimoidian skulls as some kind of death symbol, but that was just a story. The B-1s simply looked like the workers who built them. By 32 BBY, the Trade Federation was ready to test its droid army. When they blockaded the planet Naboo, their B-1 forces operated under the direction of a massive ship called the Vutun Pala. This is what the Federation called a droid control ship, essentially a flying supercomputer that controlled every battle droid on the planet below. The canon reference book Star Wars Complete Vehicles details this vessel, which measured over 3,000 meters across and contained huge transmitters, antennas, and extra power generators to run them all. At its center was the Control Brain Network, which sent signals to every battle droid telling them exactly what to do. The ship also carried up to 1,500 Vulture droids, automated starfighters that could swarm enemy vessels, along with landing craft, tanks, and troop transports for the ground invasion. The system worked simply, but it had a critical flaw. One massive computer coordinated hundreds of thousands of droids at once, sending commands that each B-1 would follow without thinking. Individual droids needed almost no processing power, because all the thinking happened on the ship above. This made each droid very cheap to build, but it also meant the entire army depended on a single point of failure. The control signals directed each droid's actions, making up for what engineers described as the very limited onboard logic systems of the minimalist droids. Without this constant signal and its stabilizing carrier wave, the droids would become completely useless. The Canon reference book Complete Vehicles refers to the droids as terminals, not soldiers, not even machines in the full sense, just receiving equipment that could not act on its own. The B-1s could not handle any tactic more complicated than walking forward and shooting. Anything beyond that had to come from the control ship, and without that computer, they were nothing. The disaster at Naboo proved exactly how dangerous this weakness could be. In the 1990 film The Phantom Menace, young Anakin Skywalker fired torpedoes into the droid control ship's reactor and destroyed it. The explosion did not just destroy one ship, it shut down the Federation's entire army in an instant. Every battle droid on the planet went into sleep mode, and Gungan warriors, the amphibious natives who had been fighting for their lives moments before, started kicking motionless droids across the battlefield. The Federation's entire invasion force had been beaten by destroying a single ship. As a result, the Trade Federation ordered a major change. Their B-1 units would be upgraded with better cognitive modules that allowed independent thought, which would prevent the mass shutdowns that had destroyed their invasion force. Canon sources note that the new B-1 battle droids no longer needed a control ship signal and could operate on their own. On paper, it seemed like a smart fix to an obvious design flaw. In practice, however, this decision made everything worse. Making B-1s genuinely intelligent would have cost too much money. The same corporate mindset that chose droids over living soldiers because of cost had no intention of spending serious credits on brain upgrades. For comparison, super battle droids, the heavily armored B-2 models built after Naboo, cost 200 times as much as a standard B-1. Droidicas, the rolling destroyer droids with shields and twin cannons, cost over 200 times more than a B-1 as well. The Federation paid for specialized units when specific jobs required them, but the B-1 was supposed to be produced in huge numbers. Consequently, real upgrades were not worth the expense. The irony was that even the more expensive droids had embarrassing limitations. The Legends reference book The Essential Guide to Warfare describes how B-2 super battle droids, despite costing 200 times more than a standard B-1, came with their own problems. The B-2s would plod directly into firefights, sometimes physically shoving other battle droids aside without the slightest concern for tactics or self-preservation. Their programming prioritized forward aggression over any kind of strategic thinking. Even worse, the same source notes that B-2s sometimes deleted enemies who moved out of visual range from their targeting modules. If a Republic soldier ducked behind cover and stayed there long enough, the super battle droid might simply forget they existed and move on to another target. The machines could not track threats they could not immediately see. More money bought better armor and bigger weapons, but it never bought genuine intelligence. Instead of building better droids, the Separatists stuffed new programming into old hardware. About 10 years after Naboo, the Clone Wars began. The Separatists were the faction that broke away from the Republic, using droid armies supplied by the Trade Federation and other corporate allies. Throughout the war, they pushed their upgraded B-1s even further by reprogramming them to work as pilots, gunners, damage control teams, security guards, and communications operators. These were jobs the droids were never designed to do, and the results showed. This attitude extended to the entire military structure. According to the Essential Guide to Warfare, a squad had 8 battle droids with no leader because units were either remote-controlled or pre-programmed before battle. A platoon had 7 squads, a company had 2 platoons transported via multi-troop transports, and the numbers kept growing into battalions, regiments, divisions, and full armies. A single Lucrehulk battleship could carry an entire army of over 200,000 battle droids, and no single unit mattered. The whole system was designed to absorb losses that would have destroyed any army of living soldiers. While organic squads were led by sergeants, droid squads needed no officer at all. They were simply pointed at the enemy and told to march. Clone troopers, the Republic soldiers fighting against the droids, called them clankers, and destroyed them by the dozens in every battle. The Legends novel Republic Commando: Hard Contact shows clone troopers treating battle droids with casual disrespect, viewing them as target practice rather than real enemies. From a military view, this made sense. The droids were bad shots with weak sensors and computer brains that could barely follow basic orders. Republic forces developed fighting methods specifically designed to exploit these weaknesses, and a single trained clone could destroy many battle droids without much difficulty. But the contempt went deeper than just tactical superiority. To the clones, droids were not real warriors with pride and honor, just metal targets that happened to shoot back. In the novel, one clone reflects that droids did not even have the sense to be scared, which made fighting them feel almost hollow. There was no satisfaction in defeating an enemy that did not understand it was losing. Another passage describes how droids were great on open battlefields, but useless for anything requiring judgment or adaptation. They could follow orders, but they could not think about whether those orders made sense. The clones also noticed specific weaknesses that made droids frustrating to fight. According to the same novel, B-1s were particularly poor in dense forests and complex terrain, where their limited processors could not adapt to unpredictable environments. When situations changed unexpectedly, they simply repeated whatever behavior their last command had instructed. In close quarters combat, droids performed especially badly without direction from what clones called a wet, their slang for organic officers. A firefight that would challenge living soldiers for hours might only last minutes against droids because the machines could not improvise. This created a strange dynamic on the battlefield. Clone troopers were fighting an enemy that vastly outnumbered them, but could barely function as soldiers. The droids marched forward, fired their weapons, and died in huge numbers, while the clones adapted, flanked, and exploited every limitation. The war was not a contest between equals, but trained soldiers grinding through waves of malfunctioning equipment. What the clones witnessed on battlefields across the galaxy was not just poor design, it was a system failure happening in real time. The Legends reference book, The Essential Guide to Warfare, documents what Separatist commanders discovered early in the war. Standard maintenance routines, the computer cleanup procedures that were supposed to keep droids working properly, actually erased the B-1 specialty programming. A droid trained to fly a ship would forget everything after a maintenance cycle. Everything the droids had learned since their last checkup would simply disappear, meaning the process meant to keep them functional destroyed the very upgrades keeping them useful. The solution was to skip maintenance entirely. The droids kept working on the surface, following basic commands and marching where ordered. But underneath, their cognitive modules started collecting damage that would never be fixed. Bad data piled up, processing slowed down, and systems designed for simple tasks strained under work they were never meant to handle. As a result, B-1 cognitive modules developed errors at increasing rates. Some droids shut down completely when their processors got overwhelmed by junk data. Others developed what reports called behavioral problems, freezing at critical moments, repeating the same action without finishing it, or responding to orders with outputs that made no sense. The most common symptom was talking. This is where the Essential Guide to Warfare provides the key explanation. The book states directly that upgraded B-1s often became chatty, offering running commentary on their situations as their modules struggled to process too much data. To the annoyance of the Separatist commanders, these droids narrated combat in real time, announced when they were confused, and kept talking even when silence would have been tactically smarter. The constant chatter gave away positions and caused delays as droids verbalized problems instead of solving them. The high-pitched voices that audiences recognize were not designed features. They were error messages made audible. The processors could not handle all the incoming information, and talking was how they tried to work through it. What looked like personality was actually the sound of systems failing. The tactical consequence of this extended far beyond just annoying commanders. The confusion at simple obstacles, the uncertainty about basic orders, and the surprise at getting shot all created delays and chaos across entire units. The Trade Federation and later Separatist leadership documented these problems extensively, with commanders complaining repeatedly. But no solutions ever came, because fixing the chattiness would have required either expensive new cognitive modules or proper maintenance that erased all the special programming. The Separatists chose neither option. They reserved their better cognitive modules for more capable droids like the B-2 super battle droids and the tactical droids that coordinated larger operations. The B-1s had been produced in such huge numbers that Republic intelligence estimated quintillions had been manufactured during the war, making them too numerous and too cheap to upgrade properly. The chattiness was a known problem that leadership decided was not worth fixing. Legends sources describe this as the result of the Trade Federation's stingy habits and the Techno-Union's obsession with building newer, better killing machines. But building machines meant to be discarded has consequences over time, and machines built without long-term planning tend to show it eventually. Meanwhile, the Republic's computer experts made the degradation even worse through intentional sabotage. Republic slicers, the Star Wars term for hackers, constantly attacked Separatist computer systems and inserted viruses that caused random malfunctions. Some of these viruses changed the outcome of entire battles. At Agomar, droidekas and super battle droids suddenly turned on each other, firing wildly and destroying B-1s caught in the middle while clone troopers watched and laughed. Slicers also attacked the factories, building new droids, changing code in small but damaging ways. Parts were manufactured slightly too small or too large to fit right. Targeting sensors were set incorrectly during assembly, and extra processing steps were added to communication programs that created delays under combat stress. New droids came off assembly lines already compromised, with their failures waiting to appear at the worst possible times. Adding to these problems was the chaotic nature of the Separatist military itself. The Confederacy's forces were not a unified army, but a jumble of corporate and territorial assets thrown together under a single banner. The Trade Federation, the Techno-Union, Commerce Guild, and Intergalactic Banking Clan had each invested heavily in their own warships and droid models, paying trillions of credits to various manufacturers. But these forces were never designed to work together. The same source reveals something that popular accounts of the Clone Wars often overlook. The Confederacy relied heavily on the armies and defense fleets of breakaway sectors and individual star systems, not just on droid forces. Many battles were fought between armies of organic soldiers, with no battle droids or clone troopers in sight. In some divided sectors, soldiers on both sides wore identical uniforms, and opposing fleets were made up of the same classes of warships, with only new insignia and hastily applied coats of paint indicating which side they were on. The galaxy was tearing itself apart, and the B-1 battle droids were just one visible symptom of a much deeper conflict. This meant the B-1 battle droids were just one failing part of a much larger mess. They were mass-produced infantry plugged into a military structure that had no unified command system, no standardized communications, and no clear strategy beyond overwhelming the Republic with numbers. The droids were breaking down, but so was everything else around them. The Separatists tried to solve their infantry problems with tactical droids, but these created different issues. Tactical droids had better cognitive modules that could process large amounts of data and run combat simulations constantly. They never stopped calculating, always running scenarios of upcoming battles while adjusting their plans in real time. Separatist leaders gave them more decision-making freedom, hoping for better results than battle droid commanders could provide. But independence created new problems, and tactical droids became arrogant. They refused to take orders from living commanders, viewing organic officers as weak creatures ruled by feelings rather than logic. They could not understand why organic relationships and military rank structures mattered. Some tactical droids went to higher command and recommended that their own superiors be replaced as unfit for duty, viewing these recommendations as simple improvements rather than disrespect. The Legends sources also record specific cases that show how badly this could go. At the Third Battle of Afau, a tactical droid killed its commanding officer, A Shevan major named Hum Garaf, starting a firefight in separatist lines that handed victory to the Republic. Yet before the first Battle of Plagan, a different tactical droid killed the Kirkoidan general Pierre Nagelsa, threw out his battle plan completely, and led separatist forces to victory using its own calculations. These were not malfunctions, but the natural results of giving decision-making power to machines built without any understanding of loyalty or limits. By contrast, the B-1s never developed that kind of ambition. They just kept breaking down and narrating the process. While tactical droids calculated whether their commanders deserved to live, the B-1s struggled with far simpler problems. They had no ambition, no strategy, no ability to question orders. They simply kept marching, kept firing, and kept narrating their own failures until something finally shut them down. The Legends novel Republic Commando: Hard Contact captures a moment that cuts through all the tactical analysis. After a brief, brutal firefight with a droid patrol, one clone trooper pauses over the wreckage and wonders how long a firefight felt to a droid, whether 5 minutes felt like 5 minutes to a machine, or whether their processors experienced time differently. He found himself wondering if the droids even knew they were losing. Later in the same novel, another clone has a more troubling thought. He asks whether ordinary people see clones the same way clones see droids. The clones were also manufactured, programmed for war, and designed to be thrown away. The parallel was uncomfortable, and the novel does not offer any easy answer. But there was one crucial difference. The clones knew what was happening to them. They understood fear, exhaustion, and the weight of watching brothers die. The B-1s understood nothing. They had no awareness of their own condition, just processors so overwhelmed that they could not even fail silently. The clones earned their contempt for the machines, but some of them also recognized something sad in the comparison. Both armies had been built to be thrown away. Only one of them knew it. 3 years after the Clone Wars began, the conflict ended with a single command. When Darth Vader executed the Separatist Council on Mustafar in 19 BBY, a shutdown signal went out across every droid army in the galaxy. Billions of B-1s stopped mid-stride, mid-sentence, mid-malfunction. The chattering finally stopped. On thousands of worlds, droids that had been marching, firing, or attempting to process their next command simply froze where they stood. The war machines that threatened the Republic for 3 years became silent scrap in an instant. What remained were fields of metal scattered across thousands of worlds, the remnants of an army that was never meant to function properly in the first place. The corporations that built them had already lost. The Separatist cause had been a Sith manipulation from the beginning, designed to weaken the Republic and justify the creation of the Empire. The droids were just one more throwaway element in a larger game, used and discarded like everything else the Sith touched. The B-1 battle droid never stopped talking because it never stopped breaking. The same cost-cutting that made them ineffective soldiers also made them memorable. Corporate neglect accidentally created something that looked like personality. It was never real, but in a war manufactured for profit, even the machines seemed to have something to say about their situation.
The droids were one half of the war's manufacturing problem. The clones were the other half, and the planet that produced them had been running for 10 years before the Republic ever heard its name. The Republic went to war with an army it never voted for, never fully understood, and never asked the right questions about. That army was built to destroy it, not as an accident, not as a failure of planning, but as the plan. The timing was engineered. The loyalty was conditional in a way that almost no one in the chain of command understood, and the planet that built it had been operational for a decade before the first Senate session even acknowledged the war had started. This is the full account of how it happened, from the erased star chart that should have been the first warning, to the inhibitor chips that made Order 66 possible, to the soldiers who refused to be only what they were built to be. Every chapter of the story is a record of what gets produced when a civilization commissions something it never fully intends to examine. Chapter 1. The Hidden Planet. Kamino does not appear in the Jedi archives. not because the records are incomplete or the data is difficult to find, but because someone removed it. Star system exists, the gravitational data of the surrounding system confirms something massive should occupy that region of space. And yet, the Jedi Archives, the most comprehensive repository of knowledge in the galaxy, contain no entry for Kamino. When Obi-Wan Kenobi traces the saber dart from Attack of the Clones to its origin and arrives at this gap, Jocasta Nu concludes that if it does not appear in the archives, it does not exist. Obi-Wan's conclusion, which turns out to be correct, is that something was erased. The erasure traces back to Jedi Master Sifo Dyas, who had been warning the Jedi Council for years that a great conflict was coming and that the Republic would need a military force to survive it. The Council rejected his arguments, and Sifo Dyas, acting without Council authority and without Senate knowledge or approval, contacted the Kaminoans and placed the order himself. Then, he was killed. Arranged by Darth Tyrannus, the Sith Lord of the Galaxy knew as Count Dooku, who stepped in to manage the project and inserted the inhibitor chip program into the cloning process before the first template scan was taken. The Republic had no idea the army being built in its name had been compromised at the source before a single clone was decanted. An army ordered by a dead man, managed by a Sith Lord, built on a planet no one was supposed to find. That is what the Republic sent its generals to command. The Kaminoans themselves tell the other half of the story. By the time Obi-Wan arrives for his inspection, Prime Minister Lama Su discusses the clone army with the flat professional pride of a manufacturer reviewing a production line. The growth acceleration, the behavioral conditioning, the combat training, the obedience enhancement, all of it presented as quality control rather than anything requiring moral examination. The Kaminoans built it with expertise and enthusiasm. What happened to the product after delivery was not, by their accounting, their concern. This army was compromised before it existed. The planet that built it never considered that a problem. Chapter 2. What they built. The Kaminoans called it a product. What they were actually building was a population of human beings with a kill switch none of them knew about. The template was Jango Fett, a Mandalorian bounty hunter selected by Darth Tyrannus for reasons that went beyond simple competence. Jango was skilled, one of the most capable fighters of his era, but the selection was also ideological. The Mandalorian warrior tradition carried within it an entire cultural framework around combat, discipline, and the acceptance of death as an occupational condition. A template who embodied that framework would produce soldiers who arrived already oriented towards exactly the kind of life they were being designed to live. Growth acceleration pushed the clones to full physical maturity in a decade rather than two. Not an unfortunate side effect, but a central feature of the specification. The Republic needed an army quickly, and the Kaminoans solved the inconvenience of standard human development timelines by engineering it away. With full knowledge that they were producing beings who would be old men in their 30s and dead before what the broader galaxy would consider late middle age. They knew. They built it that way anyway. In Legends, the Republic Commando series documents a training program run by the Quival Dar, a group of 100 Mandalorian warriors recruited by Jango to instill warrior culture directly into the clones' upbringing. This was not just tactical training, but identity formation, giving the clones language, values, and a sense of belonging designed to make them excellent soldiers. What the Kaminoans had not fully accounted for was that this process also created the foundation for the individuality they would later spend considerable effort trying to contain. The inhibitor chip was the final layer, a biologically embedded device in every clone's brain, presented to the Jedi Order as a safeguard against clone aggression, documented in the Clone Wars Season 6. When activated by a specific command, it would override the clone's conscious will entirely, not degrade it, not redirect it, override it. The Kaminoans knew what it did. The Jedi were told something else entirely. This wasn't loyalty, it was design, and one piece of that design was never disclosed to the people who would be commanding it. Chapter 3. The Jedi Blind Spot. The Jedi Order accepted the clone army at Geonosis. That is the failure, not the absence of suspicion, not a deficit of intelligence, the acceptance itself, without the examination that acceptance required. Reservation existed. Mace Windu's discomfort is visible in Attack of the Clones. Yoda's line after the battle, that victory it was, but clouded the future remained is not the statement of a leader who feels uncomplicated triumph. Several Jedi across the Clone Wars series expressed serious unease about their role as generals of an army they did not choose. But reservation is not refusal, and the Jedi's failure was not primarily one of suspicion, but of examination. They took the army because the alternative was watching the Separatists destroy the Republic and everyone they were sworn to protect. That was a real consideration, and it was not wrong. It was also exactly the kind of pressure the plan had been designed to create. The structural trap was this: a general who examines their troops as engineered products rather than soldiers cannot command those troops effectively. The Jedi who built genuine relationships with their clones, who knew their names, recognized their individual traits, trusted them across hundreds of engagements, were also the Jedi most exposed when Order 66 activated. Closeness that made the Jedi-clone partnership so effective in combat was the same closeness that made the betrayal so complete. The chip did not care about their relationship. When the command came, it performed its function regardless of what had been built before it. The specific moment that encapsulates this most precisely is the Fives arc in the Clone Wars Season 6. Fives discovers the inhibitor chip program, removes his own chip, and attempts to warn the Jedi Order. He gets close enough that Palpatine has to intervene personally, meeting with Fives alone, administering a drug to make his subsequent behavior erratic enough to be dismissed as paranoia, framing the truth as the delusion of a malfunctioning clone. Shaak Ti, who had more direct experience with the clones than almost any other Jedi, investigates and accepts the cover. The warning was real, and the system absorbed it. In Legends, the Republic Commando series adds an institutional layer. The clones existed in a legal gray area the Republic never formally resolved. No right to resign, no meaningful retirement, no legal standing outside their military function. The Jedi had the moral authority to challenge this arrangement. They never mounted a formal objection. The war was ongoing. The objection could wait. They cared about the clones. That is exactly why they failed. Caring about individuals is easier than questioning the system that produces them, and that gap between personal decency and institutional accountability was where the plan lived. Chapter 4. They became people. The Kaminoans built the clone army to produce reliable, interchangeable instruments. What they actually produced was a population of human beings, and that distinction is not incidental to the story. It is the mechanism that made Order 66 as catastrophic as it was. The individuality expressed itself in every way the conditioning had failed to engineer away. The clone designations were numerical, but the clones themselves used nicknames given to each other through shared experience. Rex, Cody, Fives, Echo, Hardcase, Waxer, Boyle. None of them official, all of them the product of a human impulse towards identity that 3 years of accelerated training had narrowed but could not eliminate. Clone troopers collected things, formed preferences, grieved specific losses, maintained friendships across deployments and reassignments with the specificity of people who understood exactly how replaceable they were considered to be and refused to treat themselves that way. The Clone Wars series documents what this looked like in practice. Waxer memorized the name of a child on Ryloth and carried it. The 501st developed tactical opinions that diverged from standard doctrine and argued for them. Domino Squad failed their evaluation not because they lacked capability, but because they had not yet learned to function as a unit, which is to say, they were still learning the way people learn rather than performing as specified. The Kaminoans saw this and called it behavioral variance. The clones saw it and called it being alive. Every bond the clones formed made Order 66 more devastating, not less. Every Jedi who knew a clone by name, every clone who had served alongside a Jedi through 3 years of combat, every relationship built across hundreds of shared engagements, all of it became the specific content of the betrayal when the chip activated. The more human the clones became, the more complete the collapse of everything the Republic had built its war effort around. The Kaminoans had designed instruments. The instruments had become people, and Palpatine had designed Order 66 to use both facts simultaneously. The Bad Batch represent the outer limit of this logic. Clone Force 99, Hunter, Wrecker, Tech, Crosshair and Echo were individuals whose combination of enhanced capabilities and distinct personalities made them extraordinarily effective in the field and impossible to treat as interchangeable, and Omega, the unmodified female clone who exists outside the weapon function entirely, is what results when you remove every military purpose from a Kaminoan creation and ask what remains. What remains is a person. The more human they became, the more catastrophic Order 66 would be. The system had been built to use that against them. Chapter 5. Built to Betray. The Clone Wars did not lead to Order 66, they enabled it. The full architecture of how Palpatine engineered the clone army into the Republic's executioner requires holding several threads simultaneously. The commissioning through Sifo-Dyas and then Tyrannus was the foundation. The inhibitor chip, inserted into the cloning process before the first batch was decanted, was the mechanism. The sustained management of a galactic war that he was running from both sides simultaneously, as Supreme Chancellor directing the Republic and as Darth Sidious directing the Separatists, was the operational layer that kept the Jedi dependent on the clone army and prevented any pause long enough for real examination. The Fives arc in the Clone Wars Season 6 is the closest the timeline comes to documenting how this nearly unraveled. Tup, a trooper in the 501st, experiences a premature chip activation at Ringo Vinda and kills Jedi General Tiplar without a triggering order, and the anomaly draws attention. Fives refuses to accept the Kaminoan explanation, tumor, malfunction, defect, and begins his own investigation, removes his own chip, and discovers that the device is present in every clone and does exactly what it was designed to do. He gets to Palpatine, who meets with him alone, and administers a drug that makes Fives' subsequent testimony erratic enough to be dismissed as chip malfunction. He is killed by a clone shock trooper before the examination can happen. What Fives found was true. What happened to that truth illustrates the precision of the preparation. The warning system had been neutralized by the same hand that had built the thing the warning was about. Rex's partial resistance in the Clone Wars Season 7 is the most specific documentation of what the chip actually did. Ahsoka removes his chip just after Order 66 activated. Rex, with his chip removed, is himself, the man who had spent years building genuine relationships with the Jedi he served. Rex, with his chip intact while the order was being given, would have continued to be something else entirely, a version of himself that retained every capability and operated completely outside his own will. In Legends, the mechanism is psychological conditioning rather than a biological implant, but the outcome in both continuities is the same. The kill switch was in place before the weapon was ever deployed. The war didn't lead to Order 66, it enabled it. 3 years of dependency, trust, and irreplaceable relationships, all of it leveraged for the moment Palpatine chose to use it. Chapter 6. The night it happened. Order 66 executed across the galaxy in a matter of hours. Revenge of the Sith documents the scale of it in a sequence that cuts between engagements with the brevity of a ledger. Ki-Adi-Mundi on Mygeeto, Isla Secura on Felucia, Plo Koon above Cato Neimoidia, Das Ali on Salukami. Each scene is seconds long. A few frames of Jedi dying, clones firing, and then the next. And the brevity is exactly the point. 3 years of partnerships, 3 years of combat alongside people who had trusted them with their lives, ended in moments without ceremony and without recognition of what was being destroyed. The handful who survived did so by specific accident rather than design. Obi-Wan fell into water a moment before Cody's shot could confirm the kill. Yoda's recognition to the Force gave him a fraction of a second's warning. Enough. Ahsoka, on the other hand, got lucky that Rex was strong enough to resist Order 66 for long enough to remove the chip, which meant the one closest to her was also the only clone in the operation who had a choice about what to do next. Kanan Jarrus was a Padawan whose master sacrificed herself to give him more time to run. In every case, the margin was specific, unrepeatable, and available to almost no one else in the galaxy that night. What the chip produced in clones who executed the order is visible most clearly in Rex. Rex, despite having the chip in him when Order 66 was activated, managed to resist attacking Ahsoka through sheer will long enough for her to remove his chip. He then immediately fought to protect her. Had they taken any longer, he likely would have killed her. The same man, the same memories, the same relationships, the same 3 years of earned loyalty, all of it rendered irrelevant by a device installed before he was born by a man he had never met. That is what the Kaminoans had placed in every clone in the army. Not a soldier who might turn, a soldier who would, when the moment came, turn completely. 3 years of the Republic's war effort ended in seconds. What it had been built on, the trust, the partnerships, the relationships the Jedi had formed with the people fighting beside them, turned out to be the thing that made the collapse so total. Chapter 7. The System That Failed. Every institution in the chain made choices that were, in isolation, defensible. The Kaminoans built what they were paid to build. The Senate accepted an army it had not commissioned because the alternative was watching the Separatists win. The Jedi took command because someone had to, and because the relationships they built with the clones were real and mattered, and were also, by design, exactly the vulnerability Palpatine needed. Each choice followed from the one before it. Each institution handed the problem to the next. None of them stopped. The Kaminoans are the clearest illustration of where that logic ends. They tracked behavioral variants in the clone population, euthanized those they considered defective, and presented the inhibitor chip to the Jedi as something it was not. Their professional pride in the quality of the product did not extend to examining the ethics of the product's existence. They defined their obligations by the terms of the contract, and the contract did not include a line about what the beings produced were owed when the war was over. In the Legends Republic Commando series, Jedi like Etain Turmukin and Arligan Zay did ask the questions about the clones' legal standing, their rights, what the Republic owed the people fighting its war. The institutional response was to manage their concerns rather than address them. The inquiry was routed around. The machine kept moving. The clones themselves are the only element of this history that comes out on the right side of it. Built to be instruments, they became people. Designed to be obedient, they developed judgment. Engineered to be temporary, they form relationships that outlasted the war. The Republic, the Kaminoan production system, and in some cases, the Empire itself. The Bad Batch survived, Rex survived, Echo survived, Omega survived. The story does not end with Order 66. It continues in every clone who carried their humanity through a system designed to make humanity inconvenient and found, on the other side, that the system had not taken everything. Kamino itself was eventually destroyed by the Empire it had served, as documented in the Bad Batch. The planet that had survived its own near extinction by becoming the best in the galaxy at manufacturing expendable life was, in the end, treated as expendable. The Empire had what it needed, and the contract was concluded. The Republic commissioned its own end and called it protection. The clones built for that purpose refused, in every way available to them, to be only that. That distinction between what a system intends and what the people inside it become is the only thing in this history worth calling a victory. The galaxy remembers the Clone Wars as the Republic's final chapter, 3 years of conflict that ended with the Jedi destroyed, the Senate dissolved, and an empire rising from what remained. That account is inaccurate and incomplete, because it treats the clone army as backdrop rather than subject. The clones were not extras in the Republic's final chapter, they were the mechanism of it, built by a planet that treated life as a manufacturing problem, commissioned by a dead man whose warning had been ignored, weaponized by a Sith Lord who understood that the most reliable way to destroy an institution is to get that institution to build its own destroyer, and trusted with everything. The outcome could have been different at multiple points if different choices had been made. What the history makes clear is what it cost to make the choices that were made, and what it cost the people who had no choices at all. The clones did not choose Order 66. The Republic did not choose to fall, but somewhere between those two facts is the truth about what happens when a civilization stops asking the questions that feel too expensive to answer. Kamino built the weapon. The war that pulled the trigger needed a reason to exist, and the man who needed that war had been working towards it for decades. Every other path he could have taken to power had closed, one by one, until war was the only option left. Palpatine is often portrayed as starting the Clone Wars purely out of evil ambition, but when you look across both canon and legends, a more complicated picture emerges. Taken together, those sources show a figure who, for decades as Naboo's senator, accumulated power through patience, manipulation, and a system that consistently worked in his favor. The Republic's bureaucracy protected him, enabled him, and rewarded his restraint. And then, in 22 BBY, he abandoned all of it and triggered a war that would kill trillions. The question isn't whether Palpatine wanted war, it's why every other path stopped working. What followed wasn't a sudden decision, but a narrowing of possibilities. One by one, every alternative vanished, until only one remained. Chapter 1: Peaceful Reform Failed. For 1,000 years since the Ruzan Reformation, the Galactic Republic had maintained peace without a standing military. This was staggering for a government spanning millions of star systems. The Jedi Order served as peacekeepers, but they numbered only around 10,000 knights and masters across the entire galaxy. That was roughly one Jedi for every 100,000 systems. The Republic functioned not through force, but through tradition, shared belief, and the illusion that the system worked. Palpatine could have worked within this system. He could have accumulated enough influence to reform the Senate, dismantle corporate power, and centralize authority through legitimate political means. He had the patience, he had the position, he had decades of experience manipulating Republic institutions. The Sith had waited since Bane's era. A few more decades of careful maneuvering seemed like nothing compared to that. But the Senate had become paralyzed by corporate interests and administrative standoff. The Trade Federation, the Banking Clan, the Techno Union, and other mega-corporations had gained voting representation in the Senate itself. These weren't just lobbyists influencing policy, they were actual voting members with the same standing as planetary governments. Corporate interests didn't merely shape the Republic law, they wrote it, voted on it, and profited from it directly. The Outer Rim territories were effectively abandoned, with piracy rampant and slavery openly practiced on worlds like Tatooine, despite being technically illegal. The core worlds hoarded resources while frontier systems struggled. The gap between wealthy and impoverished regions was widening every year. Entire sectors had effectively seceded in all but name, operating under Hutt control or corporate exploitation while still nominally belonging to the Republic. Reforming the Republic peacefully would take decades, but Palpatine didn't have decades. It would mean confronting the corporate interests that control the Senate, dismantling the corruption that benefited powerful constituencies, and rebuilding institutions that had decayed over centuries. Such reform would face opposition at every step. The Banking Clan alone could crash entire planetary economies if threatened. The Trade Federation maintained its own military forces. Any serious reform effort would be blocked, watered down, or simply ignored. The judicial forces that existed were inadequate for a government of this scale. There was no unified currency enforcement, with credits fluctuating based on Banking Clan manipulation. There was no effective law enforcement in the Outer Rim, where Hutt cartels operated openly. Each shortage created vulnerability, and each institutional gap created opportunities for those who wanted to exploit the system rather than fix it. The invasion of Naboo in 32 BBY demonstrated what Palpatine was dealing with. When the Trade Federation blockaded and then invaded his own home world, the Senate's response was pathetic. Chancellor Valorum attempted to send Jedi negotiators, but when that failed, the Senate could only form committees to investigate. Queen Amidala's plea for intervention was met with calls for more bureaucratic procedures. A member world was under military occupation, and the galactic government debated proper protocol. Palpatine used this moment to become Chancellor. He encouraged Amidala to call for a vote of no confidence in Valorum. The motion passed because everyone recognized the system was broken. Senators who had blocked reform for years suddenly found themselves voting for change, not because they wanted it, but because the alternative was admitting the Republic had already failed. But the Naboo crisis reveals something more important. It proved the Republic couldn't defend its own member worlds against corporate aggression. It proved the Senate was incapable of decisive action. Emergency measures were the only way to get anything done. The crisis also proved something about the galactic population. They would accept strong leadership if given sufficient justification. Fear was a more reliable political tool than hope. Palpatine understood something about political systems that most didn't. At its core, government is an organized belief and collective trust. If people accept something as legitimate, then it has legitimacy, at least temporarily, until that perception collapses. The Republic's dysfunction wasn't accidental. It was the result of deliberate manipulation over centuries by corporate interests that benefited from weak central authority. The system was designed to fail at everything except enriching those who controlled it. A functional republic with popular support couldn't be overthrown, but a dysfunctional republic that citizens had lost faith in was vulnerable. The republic was already dying. The only question was who would control what came next. Palpatine could wait for the collapse and try to seize power in the chaos, or he could engineer the collapse himself, shaping events to ensure he emerged on top. The system couldn't be saved slowly. Reform was a door that had closed long before Palpatine walked through it. The Republic's rot ran too deep, its corruption too entrenched, its dysfunction too profitable for those in power. Peaceful transformation was a fantasy. The only question was what form violent transformation would take. But if the Republic couldn't be reformed from within, there was still one possibility Palpatine hadn't accounted for: the galaxy simply deciding to leave. Chapter 2: Secession broke the illusion. For years after becoming Chancellor, Palpatine's strategy had worked perfectly. He accumulated emergency powers during crises, he positioned loyalists throughout the bureaucracy, he manipulated events from behind the curtain while maintaining the appearance of democratic normalcy. The Republic remained intact, and Palpatine remained hidden within it. He was the spider at the center of an invisible web, pulling strings that no one could see. Then the separatist movement exploded. By 22 BBY, the political crisis had reached its breaking point. Count Dooku, a former Jedi Master who had left the Order, emerged as the leader of a legitimate political movement. Systems across the Outer Rim and Mid-Rim were seceding from the Republic, and they had reasons that resonated with billions. Dooku spoke of self-determination, of freedom from core world exploitation, of building something better than the corrupt institution the Republic had become. The Separatists weren't wrong about the Republic's problems. That was what made them dangerous. Dooku's speeches about Senate corruption resonated because they were largely accurate. Systems joined the Confederacy of Independent Systems not because they supported hidden Sith machinations, but because the Republic had genuinely failed them. The grievances Palpatine had exploited to become Chancellor were now fueling a movement he couldn't control. Entire civilizations felt ignored, exploited, and abandoned. The Trade Federation, the Commerce Guild, the Corporate Alliance, and the Techno Union threw their support behind the Confederacy. These organizations controlled vast manufacturing capacity and droid armies. The separatist movement had transformed from political discontent into an alternative government with military capability. They had shipyards, factories, resources, and millions of battle droids ready to defend their independence. Palpatine faced a brutal choice: allow the secession and watch the Republic fragment into irrelevance, or fight to preserve the Union. There was no middle path. Negotiation would only legitimize the separatist cause and encourage more systems to leave. Appeasement would signal weakness and accelerate the collapse. The Republic couldn't survive as a voluntary association of systems that might leave whenever they disagreed with policy. If the Separatists succeeded peacefully, Palpatine would rule half a galaxy at best. His decades of carefully positioning himself at the center of the Republic's power would be wasted. The systems leaving the Republic would be beyond his reach, governed by a confederacy he didn't control. His title of Supreme Chancellor would mean nothing if half the galaxy didn't recognize his authority. Worse, a peaceful split would demonstrate that the Republic's problems could be solved through separation rather than transformation. Other systems would follow. The Republic would shrink year after year while the Confederacy grew. Palpatine's power base would erode beneath him. he would become chancellor of an increasingly irrelevant rump state while the real galactic power shifted elsewhere. Shadow control only works when there's something unified to control. A fractured galaxy couldn't be ruled from the shadows. It would require choosing sides, picking winners, and accepting diminished authority. The web Palpatine had spent decades spinning would be torn apart by political fragmentation. His influence depended on the Republic existing as a single entity with centralized decision-making that he could manipulate. The Separatist crisis demanded a response that shadow manipulation couldn't provide. Palpatine needed the Republic to remain whole. He needed every system under one government, one authority, one eventual empire. The Sith vision required galactic dominion, not regional influence. Ruling half a galaxy was a failure, not a success. That meant the succession had to fail, and peaceful failure wasn't possible when the Separatists had legitimate grievances and military power. Only war could force the rebellious systems back under central control. Only military victory could demonstrate that leaving the Republic wasn't an option. Only conquest could ensure that Palpatine's authority extended to every corner of the galaxy. The quiet path had closed. The Separatist movement had grown too large and too legitimate to be undermined through political manipulation alone. It required a military response, which meant Palpatine needed a military to respond with. Secession forced Palpatine's hand outward, but the threat building inside the Republic was even more dangerous, because the Jedi were already pulling at threads that led straight to him. Chapter 3: The Jedi Were Catching On. Patience had always been the Sith's greatest weapon. For 1,000 years after Darth Bane established the rule of two, the Sith had worked in secret. Master trained apprentice, knowledge accumulated, and the galaxy remained ignorant of their existence. Nothing forced Palpatine to act on any particular timeline. He could have spent another decade consolidating power, another generation preparing for the final move. The Sith had endured this long. They could wait longer. Then, Darth Maul appeared on Naboo. The discovery of a Sith Lord in 32 BBY shattered centuries of assumptions. The Jedi had believed the Sith extinct, destroyed at the Battle of Ruzan, and never seen again. Maul's appearance proved otherwise. Qui-Gon Jinn's dying words confirmed that the attacker was a Sith, and Obi-Wan Kenobi had slain him in combat. The Jedi now knew with certainty that their ancient enemy had survived. But the Jedi knew the rule of two. They knew that Sith always came in pairs. Maul was the apprentice. His fighting style, his age, and his role in the Naboo conflict all marked him as the student rather than the teacher. Somewhere, a master remained hidden. The Jedi began searching for this hidden Sith Lord with renewed purpose. For 10 years after Naboo, the Jedi had searched for this hidden Sith master without success. The dark side clouded their vision, making it difficult to sense the presence they knew must exist. But the investigation never stopped. Jedi intelligence operations continued probing. Connections were being made, however slowly. Every political manipulation, every suspicious coincidence, every unexplained event was examined for signs of Sith involvement. The concealment of Palpatine's identity depended on the dark side's ability to cloud Jedi perception. This technique had been developed and refined over centuries by Sith Lords following Bane's rule of two. Layer upon layer of deception, misdirection, and force manipulation kept the Sith hidden from those who would destroy them. But it wasn't perfect. Strong Force users, particularly those with precognitive abilities, might eventually see through the deception. Yoda had sensed that the dark side surrounded the Chancellor. The ancient Jedi Master couldn't identify the source, but he felt the corruption emanating from the Senate's highest office. Mace Windu harbored suspicions about the accumulation of emergency powers, watching as crisis after crisis expanded the Chancellor's authority beyond anything the Republic's founders had intended. The Jedi Council was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the role as advisors to a government that seemed to drift further from their principles each year. Every year of peace was a year in which the Jedi might discover the truth. Every meditation session might reveal Palpatine's presence on the dark side. Visions were troubling Jedi Masters across the galaxy. The Force itself seemed clouded, shrouded in darkness that made seeing the future increasingly difficult. Some Jedi wondered if the dark side was growing stronger, though they couldn't identify why. If the Jedi had another decade of peace to investigate, they might have found Palpatine. The more the Council examined the events surrounding Naboo, the Clone Army's creation, and the Separatist movement's rise, the closer they came to seeing the pattern. Too many coincidences, too many events benefited the Chancellor. Too many threads that seemed to lead back to the same hidden hand. The Jedi were also beginning to question their own role in the Republic. Their traditional position as peacekeepers and advisors had been compromised by political entanglement. Some masters argued for withdrawal from galactic affairs, for a return to pure Force study and meditation. Such withdrawal would have given them clarity, distance, and perspective. It might have allowed them to see what was hidden in plain sight. Time was working against him. Maul's exposure had started a clock that Palpatine couldn't stop. Every day brought the Jedi closer to understanding. Every investigation narrowed the possibilities. Every suspicious glance from a council member increased the risk of discovery. Delay meant discovery. The Jedi were closing in on the truth, but they didn't know that the answer to their investigation was already growing in a cloning facility on a stormy world at the edge of the galaxy. Chapter 4: Clone Army Blocks Path. Approximately 10 years before the Clone Wars, Jedi Master Sifo Dyas secretly commissioned the creation of a clone army for the Republic. Sifo Dyas had foreseen the coming conflict through Force visions and believed the Republic would need soldiers. He acted without the knowledge or approval of the Jedi Council, convinced that the threat he sensed required immediate action. The Council had removed him for his aggressive views on military preparation, but Sifo Dyas remained convinced of his visions. Palpatine didn't create this opportunity, but he seized it completely. Sifo Dyas was killed on orders from Count Dooku, now secretly the Sith apprentice, Darth Tyrannus, and the Sith took control of the clone project. The Kaminoans believed they were still working for the Republic through proper channels. In reality, they were building an army whose true purpose was only known to the Sith. Every aspect of the project was subverted to serve Palpatine's ends while maintaining the appearance of legitimate Republic military preparation. The clones were modified with inhibitor chips containing programming for Order 66, the command that would turn them against their Jedi generals. This modification was made without the Kaminoans' full understanding of its purpose. They believed the chips controlled aggressive tendencies and ensured loyalty. They didn't know that buried within the programming was a command that would transform loyal soldiers into executioners. From the very beginning, the clone army was designed to be a weapon against the Jedi, not merely a tool for fighting separatists. The genetic template came from Jango Fett, one of the galaxy's most dangerous bounty hunters. The clones inherited his combat instincts, his discipline, his ability to follow orders without hesitation. They were trained to be perfect soldiers, conditioned to obey authority absolutely. The Kaminoans took pride in their product, unaware that they were creating instruments of genocide. Once this army existed, Palpatine's options narrowed dramatically. The clones were growing in their ranks on Kamino. The inhibitor chips were installed. Order 66 was programmed and waiting. Millions of soldiers were being trained to fight alongside Jedi to earn their trust, to position themselves for the ultimate betrayal. The weapon existed, it had to be used. This weapon couldn't be stored indefinitely. The Kaminoans expected delivery. Questions would eventually be asked about who would order the army and why Jedi investigations might uncover the project's true nature. The longer the army sat unused, the greater the risk of exposure. Someone would eventually trace the payment. Someone would eventually question why a dead Jedi had ordered millions of soldiers. Someone would eventually examine those inhibitor chips closely enough to discover their true purpose. The clones represented an enormous investment of resources and planning. They were designed for a specific purpose: to destroy the Jedi Order in a single, coordinated strike. Any delay risked revealing the trap before it could be sprung. The clones were aging at accelerated rates, their finite lifespans shrinking with each passing month. Palpatine could have abandoned the clone project. He could have let Sifo-Dyas's army remain undiscovered, found another way to deal with the Jedi, and chosen a different path to the Empire. But once he took control of the clones and installed Order 66, those alternatives vanished. The investment was too great. The opportunity was too perfect. The risk of discovery grew with each passing year. The trap was built, now it had to be sprung. The weapon was ready, but for it to work, Palpatine needed the Jedi exactly where the clones could reach them: scattered, isolated, and trusting the soldiers standing right behind them. Chapter 5: Jedi Forced Apart. 10,000 Jedi served across the galaxy. The Temple on Coruscant was the center of Force knowledge, and the Council advised the Republic's highest leaders. For centuries, the Jedi had maintained peace through reputation, skill, and the perception of invincibility. In open conflict, facing 10,000 Force users trained from childhood in combat would be catastrophically costly. Many would escape any conventional military operation. Survivors would rally resistance. Even a handful of escaped Jedi could inspire rebellions for generations. Palpatine could have tried to marginalize the Jedi politically. He could have turned public opinion against them, stripped their authority, expel them from the Republic's decision-making processes. A sustained propaganda campaign might have painted them as religious extremists, unelected power brokers, or relics of a barbaric age. Over decades, the Order might wither from neglect and irrelevance as fewer families sent their Force-sensitive children to the Temple. But Order 66 couldn't work with the Jedi concentrated in the Temple on Coruscant. The inhibitor chips required a specific scenario: Jedi isolated from each other, surrounded by clone soldiers they trusted, positioned across distant battlefields with no time to warn one another. If the Jedi remained unified in their temple, they could sense the attack coming. They could coordinate defense. They could protect each other. The temple's defenses, combined with 10,000 Force users fighting together, would be nearly impenetrable. Political removal would leave the Jedi intact as an organization. They would still train new generations. They would still maintain their temple, their archives, their connections with the Force users across the galaxy. They would still represent a threat to any Sith regime. A marginalized Jedi Order was still a Jedi Order, capable of resurgence, capable of producing the one knight who might discover the truth and rally opposition. War offered something politics couldn't: dispersal. As military commanders, Jedi would be assigned to lead clone armies across hundreds of worlds simultaneously. They would fight alongside these soldiers for years, forming bonds of trust and camaraderie. They would be separated from fellow Jedi by vast distances, each general isolated with their troops in their own theater of operations. The war would scatter them across the galaxy like seeds in the wind, each one alone, each one vulnerable. When Order 66 came, there would be no time to react. No warnings could be sent across the vast distances separating Jedi commanders. No coordinated defense could be mounted when the attack came simultaneously on hundreds of worlds. Each Jedi would face their executioners alone, surrounded by soldiers they had trusted with their lives, cut down before they could understand what was happening. The war also degraded Jedi capabilities beyond physical dispersal. Jedi were trained for peacekeeping, negotiation, and personal combat. They were not trained for commanding armies and prolonged conventional warfare. The philosophical conflict between their role as servants of the Force and their new role as military officers created confusion and moral compromise. Jedi who had been taught to value all life found themselves ordering soldiers into battles that would kill thousands. Some Jedi thrived in the military role, discovering talents for strategy and leadership they hadn't known they possessed. Others struggled, their connection to the Force weakened by the violence surrounding them. The war was changing the Jedi in ways that made them more vulnerable to dark side influence and less able to see clearly. They were becoming generals instead of peacekeepers, warriors instead of guardians. The very nature of the Order was being corrupted by the conflict. Peace would keep the Jedi safe, war would not. The war would scatter the Jedi and position the clones, but Palpatine still needed one more piece. The most powerful Jedi of them all, not scattered among the rest, but standing at his side. Chapter 6: Anakin became the final lever. Strictly speaking, Anakin Skywalker wasn't necessary. Order 66 would still function. The Republic would still become the Empire. The Jedi would still be destroyed. The political transformation didn't require a specific individual to succeed. Any competent administrator could manage the transition from Republic to Empire once the groundwork was laid. But the Sith philosophy demanded more than political transformation. The Rule of Two required a master and an apprentice. Since the Rule of Two began, each Sith Lord had trained a successor, passing on knowledge, power, and purpose to the next generation. Palpatine needed a successor, an enforcer, a weapon of the dark side powerful enough to hunt down any Jedi who survived the initial purge. The Empire would face threats. It would need a champion capable of defeating any Force user who rose against it. Anakin Skywalker was the most powerful Force user in a generation. His potential exceeded any Jedi living, possibly any Jedi in history. The midichlorian count in his blood was higher than any recorded, higher even than Master Yoda's. He had been born without a father, seemingly created by the Force itself. Some believe he was the chosen one of the Jedi prophecy, destined to bring balance to the Force. From the moment Palpatine first encountered the boy on Naboo, he recognized what Anakin could become. For over a decade, Palpatine cultivated Anakin's trust. He became a mentor, a father figure, the one person who seemed to understand the young Jedi's struggles. Where the Jedi Council offered criticism and restraint, Palpatine offered praise and encouragement. Where Obi-Wan maintained emotional distance as Jedi teachings required, Palpatine provided warmth and acceptance. He encouraged Anakin's attachments, his passions, his resentments toward the Council that held him back. The Clone Wars accelerated this corruption. Combat trauma, impossible choices, the weight of command, all of it pushed Anakin further from Jedi teachings. He killed in anger when enemies threatened those he loved. He tortured for information when lives hung in the balance. He made decisions that cost lives and then lived with the guilt, unable to process his emotions through Jedi meditation techniques that had never worked for him. The war gave Anakin experiences that peacetime never would have provided. He faced moral dilemmas that revealed the limitations of Jedi philosophy. He lost men under his command and blamed himself for their deaths. He witnessed atrocities and committed violence in response. Each battle pushed him further towards darkness, while the Jedi Council remained blind to his deterioration. Most crucially, the war gave Anakin something to fear losing. His secret marriage to Padme Amidala created vulnerability that peacetime might not have produced. In peace, their relationship might have been discovered and addressed. In war, it festered in secrecy, growing more desperate as death surrounded them. When visions of her death and childbirth began tormenting him, Anakin became desperate for any power that could save her. Palpatine offered that power. The dark side, he promised, could prevent death itself. His former master, Darth Plagueis, had discovered secrets of the Force that the Jedi would never teach. The Jedi didn't fear death, accepting it as natural. The Sith defied death, bending the Force to preserve what they loved. For a young man watching his pregnant wife die in his nightmares every night, the choice seemed clear. The timing mattered enormously. Ending the war too soon would have meant ending it before Anakin was ready, before his fear had grown strong enough to override his training, before his faith in the Jedi had eroded far enough to accept their destruction. before his attachment to Padme had become so desperate that he would do anything to save her, before the promise of saving her could outweigh everything else he had been taught to value. The war had to continue until Anakin reached the breaking point. Every month of conflict deepened his trauma, his exhaustion, his desperation. Every battle added to the weight crushing his spirit. Every loss reminded him that everyone he loved could be taken from him. By the war's end, he was exactly where Palpatine needed him to be: broken, desperate, and willing to embrace any power that promised salvation. Stopping the war too soon would ruin everything. The Jedi were scattered, the clones were in position, the apprentice was almost ready. All that remained was the moment itself. And by then, there was no turning back. Chapter 7. There was no way back. By 19 BBY, 3 years into the Clone Wars, the convergence was complete. The Jedi were scattered across the galaxy, commanding clone forces. Order 66 was ready to be transmitted. Anakin Skywalker had been groomed for years and was approaching his final fall. The Senate had granted Palpatine enough emergency powers that declaring the Empire would require only the right moment. There was still an exit. He controlled both sides of the conflict through his dual identity as the Chancellor and the Sith Lord. He could have arranged a negotiated peace, restored the pre-war status quo, and returned to quiet manipulation. The galaxy would have been grateful for the peace he delivered. His popularity would have soared as the leader who ended the greatest war in a millennium. But the emergency powers sustaining his authority were tied to the war itself. When the conflict ended, those powers would be reviewed. Extended wartime authority would face scrutiny from senators who had granted it reluctantly. The Senate would reassert itself, demanding the return of powers it had temporarily surrendered. The Jedi would return from the battlefields and resume their roles as peacekeepers and advisors, their attention no longer divided by military concerns. Everything Palpatine had built depended on the crisis continuing until the moment of transformation. The war wasn't just a tool for achieving his goals. It had become the foundation supporting his entire position. Without the emergency, there was no justification for emergency powers. Without the threat, there was no need for the strong leadership he provided. Peace would unravel everything. The Jedi were already suspicious. The Jedi suspicions from Chapter 3 hadn't gone away, they had deepened. The Council had discussed removing Palpatine from office if he didn't relinquish his emergency authorities after the war. Some Jedi were asking uncomfortable questions about how the clone army had been created and who really ordered it. The investigation into Sifo Dyas's death had never been closed. If the war ended without transformation, those questions would be pursued with renewed vigor. The Jedi would have time and focus to investigate. The connections Palpatine had carefully hidden might be uncovered. The trail leading from Sifo Dyas to Dooku to Sidious might finally be followed to its end. Everything could unravel with a single discovery, a single moment of Jedi insight, a single investigation that followed the right thread. The capture of Chancellor Palpatine by General Grievous and Count Dooku was the trigger mechanism for the final phase. This wasn't a separatist victory. It was another piece of Palpatine's manipulation, the last move before checkmate. He arranged his own capture, knowing exactly how events would unfold. Palpatine allowed himself to be captured, knowing that Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi would be sent to rescue him. This created the conditions for Dooku's disposal. The Count had served his purpose as leader of the Separatist movement and public face for the Confederacy. He knew too much about the Sith involvement in both sides of the war. He had to die, and he had to die at Anakin's hands, pushing the young Jedi further towards darkness. When Anakin beheaded Dooku at Palpatine's urging, the Count's final expression showed shocked betrayal. He believed he would rule alongside his master in the New Order. He had been promised power, position, a place at Sidious's side. Instead, he was being replaced by a younger, more powerful apprentice. His final moments were spent realizing that he had been a tool all along, discarded the moment his usefulness ended. Palpatine revealed his Sith identity to Anakin, gambling that the young Jedi's fear of losing Padme would outweigh his loyalty to the Order. The gamble succeeded. Anakin reported Palpatine to the Jedi Council, fulfilling his duty as a Jedi Knight. But when Mace Windu led a team to arrest the Chancellor and the confrontation turned violent, Anakin intervened. Mace Windu died. Anakin committed himself to the dark side by betraying everything he had been trained to uphold. The choice was irrevocable. There was no going back after striking down a Jedi Master to save a Sith Lord. Anakin knelt before his new master and received the name Darth Vader. The boy from Tatooine, the chosen one of prophecy, became the enforcer of the Sith. The transmission went out across Republic military channels, reaching every clone unit in the galaxy simultaneously. In the space of hours, the Jedi Order was functionally destroyed. On Megiddo, Ki-Adi-Mundi was shot down by his own troops mid-battle. On Felucia, Aayla Secura was gunned down from behind by soldiers she had led for years. On Kashyyyk, Yoda sensed the betrayal moments before it came and escaped into the jungle. On Utapau, Obi-Wan Kenobi survived only because his clone commander's shot knocked him into the water rather than killing him outright. Across hundreds of worlds, the same scene repeated. Jedi cut down by soldiers they trusted. Padawans were taken out by troopers who had protected them. Masters shot in the back while leading charges against separatist positions. The Order that had kept the peace since Ruusan was nearly exterminated in a single afternoon. Yoda and Obi-Wan survived. Perhaps a few dozen others escaped the initial purge, scattered across the galaxy, hunted and alone. But the Order as an institution was finished. The temple fell to the 501st Legion led by Vader himself. The archives were seized, the younglings were slaughtered, 1,000 years of tradition, knowledge, and Force understanding were nearly extinguished in a single day. The Republic Senate convened in an emergency session. Palpatine, showing wounds from his confrontation with Mace Windu, addressed the chamber with carefully calibrated emotion. He spoke of Jedi treachery, of an assassination attempt against the lawfully elected leader of the Republic. He painted himself as the victim of a coup, barely surviving the attack that killed the brave clone troopers who had protected him. The Senate voted. Emergency powers became a permanent authority. The Republic became the Galactic Empire. Supreme Chancellor Palpatine became Emperor Palpatine. There was no significant opposition. The war had exhausted the galaxy's patience for politics and debate. Citizens wanted order, security, and an end to conflict. If that required empire rather than republic, most were willing to accept the trade. They had been prepared for this moment by years of crisis, years of fear, years of watching democratic institutions fail to protect them. Liberty died to thunderous applause as Padme Amidala observed from the Senate chamber. But it died because the war had made the alternative seem unbearable. Peace under tyranny seemed preferable to endless conflict under freedom. Security under the Empire seemed better than chaos under the Republic. Even peace would have destroyed what he had built. The war had to end in transformation or not at all. The galaxy that emerged from those final days bore little resemblance to the one that had entered the war 3 years earlier. The Clone Wars had killed an estimated 35 trillion sentient beings across thousands of worlds. Entire civilizations had been displaced, industrial capacity had been redirected towards destruction on a scale the galaxy had never witnessed. The psychological damage was incalculable, generations traumatized by occupation, bombardment, and loss. And yet, the empire that rose from this devastation enjoyed genuine popular support. This wasn't merely the result of propaganda or fear, though both played their roles. Citizens across the galaxy had watched the Republic fail them for decades. They had seen the Senate debate endlessly while pirates raided shipping lanes. They had watched corporations buy legislation while frontier worlds starved. They had experienced the Clone Wars as proof that the old system couldn't protect them. The Empire promised something different: order instead of chaos, decisive action instead of endless committee meetings. A strong hand that would crush the threats that the Republic had tolerated. For billions of ordinary beings who had never met a Jedi and never would, the transition from Republic to Empire changed little in their daily lives, except that the HoloNet news stopped reporting on distant battles. Palpatine understood this. He had always understood this. The transformation succeeded not because he had deceived the galaxy, but because he had correctly diagnosed what the galaxy wanted: security, stability, an end to the uncertainty that had plagued the Republic's final decades. He offered these things, and the galaxy accepted them, even knowing the price. The few surviving Jedi scattered to the far corners of known space. Obi-Wan Kenobi retreated to Tatooine to watch over Anakin's infant son. Yoda vanished into the swamps of Dagobah. Others found hiding places on worlds that the Empire had little interest in controlling. They waited, meditated, and mourned. The order that had guided the Republic for 1,000 generations had been reduced to a handful of fugitives in a single afternoon. Some historians would later argue that the Jedi's destruction was inevitable regardless of the Clone Wars. The Order had grown complacent, they suggested, too comfortable in their role as guardians of a system that they no longer questioned. Others maintained that without Palpatine's manipulation, the Jedi might have survived another millennium. The debate would continue for generations, long after the Empire itself had fallen. What remained undeniable was the completeness of Palpatine's victory. Every obstacle had been removed, every rival had been eliminated, every institution that might challenge his authority had been destroyed or subverted. The 1,000-year vision of the Sith had been realized by a single man who had spent his entire adult life working towards this moment. The Clone Wars happened because 7 doors closed, reform failed, succession threatened to fracture his power base, the Jedi were investigating, the clone army demanded activation, the Jedi needed to be scattered for Order 66 to work, Anakin required more time to fall, and by the end, the war itself had become the only thing holding Palpatine's position together. Each closure eliminated an alternative. Each alternative's death made war more necessary. By the time the first Battle of Geonosis began, every other path had already been sealed. Palpatine didn't choose war from a menu of options. He arrived at war because every other door had shut behind him. Some by circumstance, some by his own hand, but all of them locked. By the time the war began, it was already too late to stop it. The Empire would rule for 23 years before its own contradictions tore it apart. But that is another story for another time. Palpatine had built the conditions for the war. The first year of fighting was where the architecture went live. Geonosis, Christophsis, Rishi, Kamino, every battle of those opening months stress-tested a system that had been designed not to win the war, but to consume the Republic from inside. The Clone Wars burned for 3 years. By the time they ended, the Galactic Republic was gone, the Jedi Order was destroyed, and the galaxy belonged to an empire. What follows covers only the first year, from the political origins of the war through the battles, betrayals, and failures that locked the Republic onto a path it could not escape. The Republic did not stumble into this conflict, it was engineered into one. Chancellor Palpatine governed the Republic while commanding the Separatist movement through his Sith apprentice, Count Dooku. Under that manufactured war, the Jedi became generals and clones proved their worth in a system that would never recognize it. The Senate surrendered authority to a chancellor who would never return it, and Anakin Skywalker began forming the bonds that Palpatine would one day use to break him. Year 1 covers the war's opening operational phase, primarily 22 BBY per Star Wars timelines published by DK in 2023. Some events in the final chapters may cross into early 21 BBY. They're included because the war's opening campaigns formed a continuous narrative. Every claim is drawn from canon sources only. Chapter 1: The First Day. Everything that followed traced back to one day, Geonosis. In a matter of hours, the Republic gained an army, the Jedi lost a generation, and one man tightened his grip on the entire galaxy. Geonosis was a barren desert world in the Outer Rim, home to an insectoid species and dominated by droid foundries producing battle droids for the Separatist cause. It housed the largest Separatist military concentration in the galaxy, and it was where the Clone Wars ignited. 212 Jedi would deploy to that world. Only 29 would come back. But that massacre did not happen in isolation. Before the arena, before the army, the war's true foundations were laid years earlier inside the Galactic Senate. The Military Creation Act had stalled in the Republic Senate. The bill proposed authorizing a centralized standing army for the Galactic Republic, an institution that had not maintained one for generations. Planetary defense forces and the Jedi Order had been sufficient during peacetime. Senator Padme Amidala of Naboo led the opposition. She argued that raising a military would provoke the growing separatist movement rather than contain it. Her position held the swing votes. As long as Amidala remained on the Senate floor, the bill would not pass. Palpatine needed her removed. The assassination chain accomplished that. Count Dooku hired the Mandalorian bounty hunter Jango Fett. Fett hired a Clawdite shapeshifter named Zem Wessel. Wessel made 2 attempts on Amidala's life on Coruscant. Both failed. But the attempts achieved their true purpose. The Jedi Council assigned Obi-Wan Kenobi to investigate the plot's origin and Anakin Skywalker to escort Amidala to safety on Naboo. Both assignments pulled critical players away from the capital. Obi-Wan's investigation led him to Kamino, and Anakin's protective detail took him to the Lake Country. The Senate opposition collapsed without Amidala's presence. With Amidala gone, the path to emergency powers opened. Representative Jar Jar Binks of Naboo served in her place. Maz Ameda, the Shagrian vice chair of the Senate and a close operative of Chancellor Palpatine, approached Binks directly and urged him to act in the face of the separatist threat. Binks proposed that the Senate grant Palpatine emergency executive powers. The Senate voted in favor. The Military Creation Act itself was never brought to a formal vote. Emergency powers rendered it unnecessary. Palpatine could now authorize a military without Senate debate, without committee oversight, without an expiration date. Those powers gave the Chancellor sole authority to deploy armed forces and bypass peacetime regulation. In a single session, the Galactic Senate surrendered its military authority to one man. No one set a time limit or demanded conditions. That single vote would cost the Republic everything. Palpatine already had an army waiting. Obi-Wan's trail had led him to Kamino, a remote ocean world conspicuously absent from the Jedi archives. Its records had been erased. On Kamino, Obi-Wan discovered a massive cloning facility producing soldiers at industrial scale. Prime Minister Lama Su informed him that 200,000 units were ready, with 1 million more well on the way. The precise meaning of that number was unclear, whether a unit referred to a single clone trooper or a larger military formation was never clarified at the time. The soldiers were clones of one man, Jango Fett. Fett lived on Kamino, serving as the Army's genetic template and combat training advisor. He had negotiated a single, unaltered clone as a separate condition alongside his financial compensation. That boy, Boba Fett, would grow into one of the galaxy's most feared bounty hunters. But that lay years ahead. What mattered now was who had ordered the army in the first place. The Kaminoans stated that a Jedi Master named Sifo Dyas had placed the original order roughly a decade earlier. Sifo Dyas had served on the Jedi Council. He foresaw a coming galactic war through visions in the Force. The Council dismissed his warnings and removed him. Later, canon sources confirmed the full scope of the conspiracy. The Clone Wars Season 6 and Dooku Jedi Lost established that Sifo Dyas was murdered and his identity co-opted by the Sith to manage the project through intermediaries. Tales of the Jedi showed Dooku erasing Kamino from the Jedi archives. None of this was known when Obi-Wan arrived. What he found was a fully operational army built on a dead man's name, waiting for a republic that had never ordered it. Palpatine activated the clone army the same day the Senate granted him emergency powers. The Republic did not ask who funded it, it asked how quickly it could deploy it. 212 Jedi had already departed for Geonosis. Most of them would never return. Obi-Wan had been captured after infiltrating a separatist gathering on the planet. He discovered that the Confederacy's founding leadership had assembled on Geonosis. Count Dooku, Newt Gunray of the Trade Federation, Poggle the Lesser of the Geonosians, Sandhill of the Banking Clan, Wat Tambor of the Techno Union, and Shu Mai of the Commerce Guild. Droid foundries across the planet were producing battle droids at enormous scale. Obi-Wan transmitted his findings to the Jedi Council before Geonosian forces captured him. Anakin Skywalker and Padme Amidala attempted a rescue from Naboo. They were also captured, and all three were sentenced to public execution in the Petranaki Arena. Mace Windu refused to wait for the clone army to arrive. He assembled a Jedi strike team of 212 and flew to Geonosis. Not all of them fought inside the arena. Some were deployed against the orbital defense cannons protecting the planet. Others flew starfighter support over the desert. The 212 represented the total Jedi force committed to the rescue. Inside the arena, the situation collapsed within minutes. Geonosian warriors flooded in from every tunnel entrance. Battle droids poured through the gates. 3 execution beasts, a Reek, a Nexu, and an Acklay tore across the arena floor. The Jedi fought with lightsabers in a confined space with no cover, no tactical advantage, and enemies closing from every direction. Blaster fire came from the stands, from the gates, and from droid formations assembling on the arena floor itself. The Jedi had trained for duels, not for suppressive fire from 300 directions. The sheer density of incoming fire turned lightsaber deflection into a survival exercise, and Jedi were struck down before they could establish defensive formations. Jedi Council member Coleman Trebor, a Verk, reached Count Dooku's observation balcony and moved to engage him. Jango Fett shot Trebor twice in the chest from close range. Trebor fell from the balcony. During the same battle, Mace Windu confronted Fett directly. Windu closed the distance through blaster fire and killed Fett with a single lightsaber strike. The genetic template for the entire clone army died in the same arena where those clones would soon arrive to fight. Across the arena and the desert above, the Jedi fell in numbers the Order had not seen in a millennium. Jedi Master Semper Vey was hit by a Geonosian sonic blast during the chaotic retreat from the arena. Her Padawan, a young Jedi named Escada Karis, witnessed her die. As Delilah S. Dawson depicted in Inquisitor Rise of the Red Blade, Akaris carried that trauma for the rest of her life. It fed her isolation, deepened her anger, and ultimately drove her into the Empire's Inquisitorious program. Of the 212 Jedi who went to Geonosis, only 29 returned to Coruscant. Yoda arrived with the first wave of clone troopers before the last surviving Jedi in the arena was overrun. Republic assault ships descended onto the desert plains. 200,000 clone soldiers deployed in formation against a separatist droid army that vastly outnumbered them. The Republic caught the Separatists still loading transport ships at their staging areas. That narrow window of surprise was the only tactical edge the clones possessed. The battle that followed was enormous and brutal. Republic gunships strafed droid formations across open desert. ATTE walkers pushed through defensive lines, while LAAT transports dropped reinforcements behind Separatist positions. Self-propelled homing spider droids and Hellfire tanks tore through clone positions in return. Gunships were shot from the sky. Clone squads that had been deployed minutes earlier were wiped out before they could reach their designated rally points. Casualties were severe on both sides, but the clones adapted under fire. Units that lost their commanding officers reorganized around surviving sergeants and continued advancing. They had been engineered for exactly this. The Separatist army suffered heavy losses on the surface, but Dooku's forces retreated with the majority of their fleet and droid reserves intact. Geonosis itself was never secured. The planet remained in Separatist hands, and its droid foundries continued production. The Republic celebrated a victory. In practical terms, the Confederacy had simply pulled back to fight another day. But the most consequential events of Geonosis unfolded away from the main battle. Count Dooku retreated to a hangar on the outskirts of the battlefield. Obi-Wan and Anakin pursued him. Dooku fought with a refined precision built on decades of experience. He had trained under Yoda himself and had spent a lifetime mastering lightsaber combat. Against Obi-Wan, he struck with controlled efficiency, wounding him with Force lightning before landing blade strikes to the arm and thigh. Against Anakin, he was dismissive. Anakin lost his right arm to Dooku's blade in a single stroke. Yoda arrived and engaged Dooku directly. The two fought with the Force and with lightsabers. Dooku could not overcome his former master. Instead, he used the Force to collapse a heavy support pillar towards the wounded Obi-Wan and Anakin. Yoda caught the pillar rather than Perse, and Dooku escaped. He flew directly to Coruscant and landed in the abandoned industrial sector known as the Works. There, Dooku delivered the Death Star plans to Darth Sidious. Blueprints for a planet-killing battle station now rested in the hands of the man who also controlled the Republic Senate. Before departing Geonosis, Dooku had revealed something to Obi-Wan that should have ended the war before it started. He told Obi-Wan that a Sith Lord named Darth Sidious controlled the Galactic Senate. It was the truth. Every word was accurate. Obi-Wan reported the claim to the Jedi Council. Mace Windu concluded that Dooku was attempting to undermine trust in the Republic and divide its allies. Yoda noted that the dark side clouded the Jedi's ability to perceive the truth. That admission should have given the Council pause. It did not. If the Council had investigated the claim seriously, the Republic might have discovered its Chancellor before the war matured. The Sith Lord who controlled the Senate remained undetected. The Jedi would not revisit Dooku's warning for years. In the quiet aftermath, Anakin Skywalker and Padme Amidala returned to Naboo. They married in secret in the Lake Country, on a terrace overlooking the water. A Naboo holy man officiated. The only guests were C-3PO and R2-D2. No Jedi attended. No senator was informed. The marriage violated the Jedi Code's strict prohibition on attachment. Anakin was 19. He had just lost his right arm. He carried grief and violence from Tatooine that he had confided to no one except Padme. The full weight of that burden would emerge later. For now, the bond was sealed, and that bond would become the deepest vulnerability in Anakin Skywalker's life. Palpatine would use it to destroy him. The first day was over, and the Clone Wars had begun. Palpatine held emergency powers with no expiration. The Republic had accepted a clone army of unknown origin without scrutiny. The Jedi had sent 212 of their own to Geonosis and buried most of them in the sand. The Separatists had retreated with the bulk of their forces intact, guaranteeing a prolonged war. Anakin had married in secret, and the Death Star plans were in the hands of the Sith. None of it was accidental. Each visible step had a visible explanation. The assassination led to an investigation. The investigation revealed an army. The army met a war. Each event appeared reactive. None of it was. The Clone Wars were not a conflict between the Republic and the Confederacy. They were a mechanism assembled by one man to destroy the Jedi, dissolve the Republic, and deliver an empire. Dooku told Obi-Wan the truth on Geonosis. The Jedi dismissed it. The war could have ended that day, but Palpatine had already ensured it would not.